When you're talking best scorers of the 21st century, some of the names that might come to mind are guys like Kevin Durant, Allen Iverson, or the all-time leading scorer LeBron James. And while Kevin Martin wasn't on that level, he was a guy who could light it up from beyond the arc, or slither into the lane and get to the free throw line at will. Honestly, a perfect player for today's game, but he arrived to the league about 10 years too early. And when a lot of your points come from the free throw line,
Kevin Martin putting it in and drawing another foul.
And you rarely make the postseason, it's easy to slip through the cracks. And no, Kevin Martin wasn't the perfect player, but he was an underdog who wasn't even supposed to make the NBA. And if we're strictly talking guys who could put the ball in the hoop, Kevin Martin was one of those guys.
Kevin Martin, best player you never heard of.
Let's jog your memory. Growing up in Ohio, Kevin Martin didn't really look like he had much of a basketball future until he hit a huge growth spurt between his sophomore and junior years at Zanesville High School. And while his junior year numbers weren't eye-popping, he made every shot count. Then by the time he was a senior, he stood at 6'5" and had become a local star, using his all-around scoring ability to be recognized as a second-team All-State member, while receiving recruiting attention from D1 programs, as his coach would commend him for sticking with it and reaching success the hard way. And it all paid off when he received a full-ride scholarship to Western Carolina University. Unfortunately, there's little footage of Martin's college years, and while the team wasn't very good, Martin was, as he was a starter from his first game freshman year and was the team's best scorer by far, averaging about 22 points and already showing the efficiency that would define him as a player for years. However, the Catamounts finished with just a 12-16 record. Western Carolina had lost 3 starters going into 03, but Martin, in a bigger role, continued improving as a sophomore, increasing his scoring and even leading the Southern Conference in that category. But the all-conference member made up most of Western Carolina's offense, as they were even worse this year, falling to 9-19. By 2004, Martin was one of the most dangerous scorers in the country, and if it hadn't been for one of Western Carolina's commits backing out from his scholarship a few years earlier, then Martin might not have even been playing D1 basketball. But no one was complaining, as not only did Martin lead the Southern Conference with nearly 25 points per game, he finished second in the NCAA, as he would lead Western Carolina to their best record during his time there. Unfortunately, this only meant 13 wins. But now there was serious buzz around Martin. The 3-time All-Conference member was a natural scorer who could hurt you from anywhere on the floor. So instead of returning for his senior year, he took a chance and declared for the 2004 NBA draft. But according to his coach, he would only keep his name in the draft if he received a guarantee that a team would take him in the first round. And the underdog Martin continued defying the odds, as he was a first-round selection, 26th overall to the Sacramento Kings. And this was big, as a first-round pick got a guaranteed contract. So now Martin brought his one-of-a-kind shooting form to the Sacramento Kings, a from-the-hip type shot that he developed as an undersized kid playing pickup with older guys. And as it continued to fall, it became more of a if it ain't broke, don't fix it situation. So the rookie Martin joined the established backcourt of Mike Bibby and Doug Christie. But this season would see a lot of personnel change in Sacramento, with Christie being swapped for Cuttino Mobley and franchise star Chris Webber being shipped to Philly. And Martin was brought along slowly, appearing mostly in garbage time throughout the season. However, also shooting much less efficiently than he had in college. Yet even with his struggles, the Kings would still finish at 50-32. However, Martin was left off of the playoff roster, as Sacramento lost to Seattle in round 1, with Martin's rookie year seeing him average about 3 points, 1.5 rebounds, and 1 assist per game. There was more change in Sacramento heading into the 06 season, as while Mobley was gone, they had brought in veteran Bonzi Wells to replace him. So Martin looked like he was going to be spending a lot of time on the bench yet again. But overall, with Sacramento trading Peja Stojakovic for Ron Artest mid-season, it was clear that they were in a period of transition. But then Martin got opportunity throughout the season and showed that he would be an important piece to the Kings' future plans. Wells went down with an injury in late December, and Martin stepped into the starting lineup and never really looked back, as over the next 43 games, he was averaging nearly 14 points and doing so just as efficiently as he had done in college. And while his shot may not have been pretty, It was going in, but that was also because Martin had made some slight tweaks so as to not obstruct his vision. And spending his first season and a half with Peja Stojakovic, Martin would learn that his meal ticket would come from his off-ball movement and catch-and-shoot abilities. And as he became a knockdown shooter, defenders played him tighter, so he would then use his deceptive quickness to get to the rack, often drawing fouls in the process. So Martin looked to be the Kings' two-guard of the future, and even when Wells came back, Martin remained the starter. But a thigh injury suffered in late March sidelined Martin for a few games, and when he returned to a Kings team coming off 2 straight wins, he had lost his starting spot, yet he still had a much bigger bench role than he had to start the year. And with the Kings going 9-2 to end the season, they would finish with a 44-38 record, which was enough for the West's final playoff spot and a date with the defending champion Spurs. The Kings would take a beating in Game 1, but come Game 2, Martin got the start due to Ron Artest being suspended, and he would show out. Martin made up for his poor Game 1 by going for 26 points while adding 8 rebounds, and he went 10 up, 10 down from the free throw line. And even though this game needed overtime, San Antonio pulled away in the extra frame, with the Spurs up 2-0 going to Sacramento. Martin would be back in his bench role for Game 3, and by the end of the game, he had just 8 points, and it wasn't looking good, as the Spurs had possession and the lead in the final seconds. But then Sacramento forced a turnover and had one last chance on the break.
Now the pick by Duncan. Not close, stolen by Bibby. Ahead to Martin, to the rim. And the Sacramento...
A twisting circus shot from Martin seemed to hang on the rim forever, but as the buzzer sounded, it fell through the net, and the Kings had made it a series. Then riding the momentum, they tied it in Game 4. And although the Spurs eventually wrapped it up in 6, Martin had showed promise, hitting double figures in every game after Game 1, as his season ended with him averaging about 11 points, 3.5 rebounds, and 1.5 assists per game. But in Year 3, Martin became the full-time starter, and he ran with the opportunity. The Kings moved on from longtime coach Rick Adelman and brought in Eric Musselman for the 07 season. And with Wells now in Houston, Martin was the team's full-time starter at shooting guard, as his scoring would nearly double from last year to lead the Kings in that category. And while he was showing that he knew how to put the ball in the basket, arguably his greatest weapon was the most simple shot, which was the free throw, as he averaged 6 points from the charity stripe alone, and made NBA history in a March 17th win over Orlando, when he became the second player ever to score at least 20 points while making just 1 shot from the field. As while he went 1 of 8, he also drained 17 free throws to finish with 20 points, joining Nate Archibald as the only other player in NBA history to accomplish that feat. But Martin was still a guy who maximized his shot attempts, as out of his 10 games scoring at least 30, he shot below 55% in just 1 of them. And his big jump on the offensive end saw him finish second to the Warriors' Monte Ellis in Most Improved Player voting. But the Kings were regressing. While they had never been known as a defensive team, their offense just wasn't what it used to be, and could no longer make up for their poor defense, as they finished at 33-49, missing the playoffs for the first time since 1998, something that Martin would say that he never hoped he would experience again in his career. But his season was over, with him averaging about 20 points, 4.5 rebounds, and 2 assists per game. The Kings were on their 3rd coach in 3 years when they began the 08 season with former King Reggie Theus at the helm. But a guy who looked like he would be there for a while was Kevin Martin, as over the summer, Martin had agreed to a 5-year extension worth upwards of $50 million, as the self-proclaimed skinny kid from a small school had come a long way. But injuries and roster change would define yet another season in Sacramento. Injuries limited Mike Bibby to just 15 games leading up to the trade deadline, before the fan favorite was shipped to Atlanta, and Artest would miss 25 games of his own this season. Then there was Martin, who stepped up in the absence of Bibby at the beginning of the season and continued his quiet rise among the league's best scorers. But in December, Martin went down with a groin injury, and overall he would miss 21 games this season. But the trade of Bibby meant a lot more offensive responsibility for Martin, and he would respond by finishing as a top 10 scorer in the league, which included a 48-point performance late in the year against Minnesota, with 22 of those points coming from the free throw line. But that game ended in a loss, as the Kings still didn't have the offense to make up for their poor defense. again missing the playoffs, as they finished at 38 and 44. And Martin finished with averages of about 23.5 points, 4.5 rebounds, and 2 assists per game. With Ron Artest being traded to Houston over the offseason, the reins were handed to a fifth-year Kevin Martin. But after a hot start to the season, scoring at least 25 points in 5 of his first 7 games, an ankle injury would sideline Martin. And even though he tried to return after about a month, he only lasted 2 games before missing another few weeks. But by the new year, he was back and had another new coach, as Theus had been replaced by Kenny Nat after a poor start, even though Martin being out with injury had definitely contributed to that. But now Martin was in the lineup, and he looked 100%, scoring 45 points in just his 3rd game back, and over his next 40 games, he would turn in the best scoring numbers of his career, culminating in an April 1st loss to Golden State, where Martin put up a 50 ball, with 23 of those points coming from the free throw line. But Martin would be shut down after this game for the remainder of the season, as the Kings finished with the league worst 17-65 record. Yet Martin again finished as a top 10 scorer over his 51 games, as he averaged about 24.5 points, 3.5 rebounds, and 2.5 assists per game. So heading into the 2010 season, the Kings possessed one of the league's best scorers in Martin, but they hadn't been doing much winning. And for as good as Martin could be on offense, you didn't get that same impact on defense. But reportedly, Martin was also growing frustrated with the organization's constant personnel changes. But he felt that the Kings' fortunes could change if they took the pass-first Ricky Rubio with their 4th overall pick. But instead, they took the combo guard, Tyreke Evans. And at that point, Martin and the Kings agreed that it was time to move on, as Sacramento made him available. But for now, he was still a King, and over his first 5 games, he was averaging over 30 points. But then he fractured a bone in his wrist and went on to miss the next 32 games. And now he was earning one of the most dreaded labels in sports, injury prone. And even when he did return, he was struggling, shooting below 40%, and the Kings were struggling even more, as they went 3-19 in Martin's 22 games after returning. But then around the trade deadline, Kevin Martin's time in Sacramento came to an end. With the Houston Rockets trying to get Tracy McGrady to the New York Knicks, they orchestrated a 3-team trade to make sure that they got Martin as a return piece, a player that they had coveted for a while. And while Martin wasn't exactly joining a contender, it was a big upgrade over Sacramento, as Martin joined a Rockets team sitting at 28-25, a team who happened to be led by Martin's first coach in Sacramento, in Rick Adelman. So the two already had some rapport, and Martin clearly had the green light from the day he arrived, as in his 24 games with Houston, he was averaging over 21 points. And even though he came on slow in Houston, he was feeling it by the end of the year. And in his second last game of the season, versus the Kings in Sacramento, he went for 39 points in a win. Yet while the Rockets remained above 500 this season, their 42-40 record still wouldn't be quite enough for a playoff berth, as Martin's overall season had seen him average about 20.5 points, 3.5 rebounds, and 2.5 assists per game. But his first full year in Houston would turn out to be arguably the best of his entire career. After missing all of the 2010 season due to injury, Yao Ming returned for the 2011 season, but he only managed 5 games, in what ended up being the final season of his career. So Houston had to look elsewhere for scoring, and the man they looked to was Kevin Martin. In his first full season in Houston, Martin had his healthiest season in years, playing and starting in 80 games for the second and final time of his career, as he would average a team-leading 23.5 points, recording 20 games with at least 30, and eclipsing the 40-point mark twice, with a lot of those points coming by way of the three-pointer. But he kept up with the usual Kevin Martin brand of basketball, which was free throws, and more free throws, attempting a career-high 669 shots from the line, yet leading the league by making 594 of them. And while the Rockets didn't really have a star, they pushed the pace and played good team ball, finishing as the 3rd highest scoring team in the league, as they had a good young point guard in Kyle Lowry and got a career year from Luis Scola. But like every team Martin had been on up to this point, defense was a glaring weakness, as while the Rockets improved on last year's record, their 43-39 finish was once again not enough for the playoffs in a competitive Western Conference, as Martin's year wrapped up with him averaging about 23.5 points, 3 rebounds, and 2.5 assists per game. The NBA lockout occurred over the summer, And after playing one of his healthiest seasons last year, and going into a shortened season this year, it seemed likely that Martin could play in every game for Houston in 2012. But there was an elephant in the room, and that was that he wasn't still supposed to be a Houston Rocket. Almost immediately after the 2011 NBA lockout ended, a blockbuster trade shook the NBA landscape, and that was the infamous Chris Paul trade to the LA Lakers, which was vetoed by NBA Commissioner David Stern, who was acting as temporary owner of the New Orleans Hornets at the time. But one of the players in that trade were the Houston Rockets, who were set to send a 28-year-old Kevin Martin to New Orleans. But less than an hour after the trade was agreed upon, it was nixed, and Martin had to return to Houston, knowing the GM felt differently about him. And with Martin now knowing that the team was ready to move on from him, it made it a tough season for the high-scoring guard. But there was something else that contributed to a more than 6-point decrease in Martin's scoring this season, and it came from a simple rule change. Kevin Martin was a master at getting to the free throw line his whole career, and one of his favorite ways to draw a foul was the rip-through move when defenders were uptight on him. But during the 2011 lockout, a rule change occurred, and while the rip-through was still a foul, it was no longer a shooting foul, as this contributed to Martin going from averaging about 8.5 free throws in 2011 to just 4.5 in 2012. But really nothing went right for Martin this season, as on top of everything that's already been mentioned, Martin again dealt with injury, and it was one of his worst. Over his first 20 games, he was averaging 21 points, but an early February injury to his right shoulder led to his numbers plummeting over his next 20 games. Then in a March 11th loss to Cleveland, Martin suffered a labral tear in the same shoulder, and he could no longer play through it, as he was shut down for the remainder of the season. And while the Rockets finished at 34-32, they again missed the playoffs, with Martin's season seeing him average about 17 points, 2.5 rebounds, and 2 assists per game. But shortly before the following season, Kevin Martin would be part of a trade which actually went through. An OKC Thunder team coming off an NBA Finals appearance would decide to trade their star sixth man James Harden, and the deal they liked best saw Harden included in a package to Houston, with Kevin Martin headlining the package sent to the Thunder. So now Martin was joining forces with two of the league's top young stars in Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook, and it looked like Martin would finally make a return to the playoffs. But he was also replacing OKC's sixth man, so Martin would make a return to the bench as well, and occupy the same role as Harden for the 2013 season. And it looked like a great move for Martin, as he was healthy and would spend the whole year coming off the bench, finishing as the team's third leading scorer. And while his scoring again saw a drop, his efficiency had returned, shooting 45% for the first time in 5 years, while shooting a career-high 42.6% from deep. As with Martin now playing with two ball-dominant MVP candidates, he didn't have as much pressure to create and could really let the offense come to him, as he would even finish top 5 in Sixth Man of the Year voting. And the Thunder were playing even better than last year, finishing with the West's top record at 60-22, and coincidentally, they would draw the Rockets in round 1. But Martin didn't have the series he was hoping for, as while the Thunder got out to a 3-0 lead, Martin had only shot about 31% in those games. Then while he had a solid 16-point Game 4, the Rockets held on to extend the series. Then Game 5 was one of the worst of Martin's career, as he scored 3 points on 1 of 10 shooting, and now it was a 3-2 series heading back to Houston. But Martin came through in Game 6, going for 25 points on nearly 54% shooting, while draining all 8 of his free throws, as the Thunder wrapped it up. But they had also lost Russell Westbrook for the remainder of the playoffs in Game 2, as OKC would need a lot more from Martin going forward. And it looked like that's what they would get, after Martin again went for 25 in their Game 1 win over Memphis. But then he went 2 for 11 in a Game 2 loss. And while he was solid over the next 3 games, OKC really felt the loss of Westbrook against the top-ranked Memphis defense, as their Game 1 win was their only win in a disappointing second-round exit, with Martin's year ending with him averaging about 14 points, 2.5 rebounds, and 1.5 assists per game. But Kevin Martin would be on the move yet again during the offseason. So aside from the inconsistent playoff run, Kevin Martin had a good season with the Thunder, and had done so on a contract year. Yet early in this season, he expressed his desire to stay with the Thunder long term. However, the Thunder didn't have the cap space to bring back Martin, so they would instead package him to the Minnesota Timberwolves, who would in turn sign Martin to a 4-year deal worth around $30 million. So Kevin Martin was back on a team that didn't look like they'd be winning anytime soon, but he was joining one of the league's best big men in Kevin Love, while also playing with the point guard that he wanted the Kings to draft years earlier. And once again, he was being coached by Rick Adelman, so Adelman knew exactly who he had in Kevin Martin, as Martin returned to a starting role. And Martin looked like he knew what he was talking about, as while he still used his shooting to space the floor, his off-ball movement in Adelman's offense, with Rubio delivering pinpoint passes, saw Martin get a lot of good shots close to the hoop off of cuts, as his scoring average jumped to over 19 points as the team's second leading scorer, and the Timberwolves became one of the league's highest scoring teams, with Martin dropping at least 30 points 7 times. But with any high-powered Rick Adelman offense came little defense, and it was back to disappointing mediocrity for Martin, as the Wolves finished at 40-42 and missed the playoffs, with Martin's season seeing him average about 19 points, 3 rebounds, and 2 assists per game. Flip Saunders took over as head coach for the 2015 season, but the Wolves had traded away Kevin Love and acquired the top pick of the 2014 draft in return, in Andrew Wiggins. So it was clearly a full rebuild going on in Minnesota, and while it would be a lot of empty stats, Martin was primed for a big season as the team's only established scoring option, and that's exactly what was happening, as Martin was averaging over 20 points on over 48% shooting after 9 games. But a November 19th game versus New York, which saw him drop 37, would also see him fracture the wrist on his shooting hand, causing him to miss the next 34 games. And while he was scoring the same upon return, he was taking a lot more shots to get his points. Yet regardless of how Martin was playing, the Wolves were losing either way, finishing with a league-worst 16-66 record, as Martin's shortened season ended with him averaging about 20 points, 3.5 rebounds, and 2.5 assists per game. Martin's play seemed to fall off a cliff the following season. He would begin the year back in his 6th-man role and was averaging about 19 points after 4 games. But then he really started to struggle, but would still get moved into the starting lineup. And in early December, he would explode for 37 versus the Lakers. But he also re-injured his wrist in that game. And with Minnesota going for more of a youth movement, Martin saw his role decrease, as he was also scoring with the worst efficiency of his career. So in early March, Martin and the Wolves agreed to a buyout, and Martin would go on to sign with the San Antonio Spurs for the rest of the season, where Martin would receive limited minutes in 16 games for a Spurs team who finished at 67-15 and got a first-round matchup with Memphis. And Martin started the playoffs strong, scoring 10 points in games 1 and 2. But after this, he rarely saw the floor, appearing just 3 more times this postseason, with the Spurs falling to the Thunder in round 2, as Martin ended his year with averages of about 9.5 points, 2 rebounds, and 1 assist per game. But Martin's Game 6 appearance in OKC would mark the end of his career, as he announced his retirement the following November, marking a quiet end to a quiet 12-year career. So while there's plenty of critiques you can make on Kevin Martin's game, like he didn't pass enough or didn't show the effort on defense, he also really wasn't even supposed to make the NBA. Yet he knew that he could score, and he used that natural ability to get himself to the highest level and quietly get buckets for over a decade, while also being held back by a variety of injuries, as well as the way the game was played when he was in the league, as his ability to space the floor with his shooting, but also get to the free throw line, would be perfect in today's NBA. So while Kevin Martin had his weaknesses, he also may have been restricted from being even better than he was. But averaging 20 points even once is a rare feat, so with Kevin Martin routinely doing that throughout his career, he deserves a little more credit. But that's it for today's episode on Kevin Martin. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on one of his Sacramento teammates, or this one on one of his coaches. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.